In a quiet southern town diner, a black art student in a wheelchair after a childhood accident is cruelly mocked by three young men. Everyone else looks away, until a Hells Angels member walks in. He steps forward to defend her, only to be falsely accused of making threats. But when the police arrive, a shocking truth is revealed that stuns the entire town. The Hells Angel is no ordinary man, and the three young men will have to pay for what they've done. Before we dive in, what time are you listening? Where are you from? Drop a comment below and tell me. The bell above the door chimed as Aisha Robinson rolled herself into the sunny diner, her hands gripping the worn rubber rims of her wheelchair. The July sun still clung to her skin, heat shimmering off the cracked Main Street pavement outside, but the air inside was cooler, thick with the smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon rolls. Forks clinked against plates, spoons stirred sugar into mugs, and the hum of low conversation filled the small space. To anyone else, it might have felt cozy. To Aisha, it felt like stepping under a spotlight she never asked for. She maneuvered toward the far table by the window, the one where she could half pretend she was part of the crowd without actually being in it. Heads turned just enough for her to notice. Not a full stare, never that, but those quick flicks of the eyes that lingered a beat too long. The kind that told her they'd already decided who she was before she had the chance to say a word. It wasn't just the chair, though that was enough for some. It was the color of her skin, the way her curls framed her face, the way her presence reminded them of things they preferred not to think about. The wheelchair had been part of her life since she was 7 years old, after a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into her mother's car on a rainy evening. Aisha had survived, but the damage to her spine was irreversible. The doctors had called her lucky to be alive. She sometimes wondered if their definition of lucky was the same as hers. The waitress, a middle-aged woman in a pink uniform, approached with a pad in hand and a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Morning," she said, as if on autopilot, glancing briefly at the chair before writing down Aisha's order without asking about her day. Aisha returned a small smile and murmured, "Thank you," knowing it wouldn't lead to conversation. She placed her sketchbook on the table beside the menu, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. Her professors from the online art program often told her she had talent, a knack for catching the softness of a person's expression. She wanted to be an illustrator one day, to tell stories with images, to give others the kind of beauty she sometimes struggled to find in her own world. But here in this diner, the dream felt far away, like something that belonged to someone else. From the corner of her eye, she noticed movement at the back booth. Three young men, maybe early 20s, leaned in together over plates of half-eaten pancakes. One elbowed the other, nodding in her direction. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, that familiar sense of bracing for something she couldn't control. A muffled snicker escaped one of them. Then came the sound, a slow, exaggerated squeak, mimicking the faint protest of her wheelchair wheels. Another joined in, dragging his sneaker on the tile to imitate the sound of something heavy scraping along. Their laughter was low at first, a private little joke they thought no one else could hear, but they wanted her to hear. She knew the pattern. It always started like this, like they were testing the water, seeing how far they could go. Aisha kept her eyes on the menu, trying to pretend she didn't notice. If she reacted, they'd only feed on it. If she stayed quiet, maybe they'd get bored. The diner's other patrons seemed to retreat into themselves. A man at the counter stirred his coffee, gaze fixed on the swirling liquid. A woman in the booth by the door lifted her newspaper higher, as if hiding behind the printed words could block out what was happening. The air grew thicker, the clink of silverware sharper against the silence that fell in pockets around her. Then one of them said it. "Careful fellas, don't scare the poor cripple, might roll right out the door." His voice carried just enough to reach her table, smooth with mockery and the ugly undertone she knew too well. Another one chuckled, adding, "Bet she draws real pretty pictures of all the nice white folks around here." The last word lingered, heavy and poisonous. Aisha's hands tightened around the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. The muscles in her jaw ached from holding her face still. She felt every heartbeat in her ears, the blood pounding like a drum. She told herself she had no reason to be ashamed, but shame didn't always need a reason, it just seeped in, uninvited. Her mind flashed back to years of hearing that same tone, whether from children on the playground or adults who thought they were clever. She'd been told once that the world was getting better, that people were learning. But in moments like this, staring down at the laminate wood grain while strangers laughed at her existence, it felt like nothing had changed at all. The waitress passed by again, her eyes darting toward the booth, then away. Aisha thought for a split second the woman might say something, but instead she busied herself wiping down an already clean counter. The hum of the refrigerator filled the gap where someone's voice should have been. The boys grew bolder. One got up, swaggering toward the front register, dragging his left leg in an exaggerated limp. He glanced sideways at her, grinning as his friends snorted behind their hands. A couple at a nearby table exchanged an uncomfortable look but stayed quiet. The unspoken rule was clear: don't get involved. Aisha kept her eyes fixed on the sketchbook, but she wasn't seeing the blank page anymore. She was seeing herself, small and silent in a room full of people pretending they couldn't hear. Her throat felt tight, a lump pressing against the base of her tongue. She wanted to vanish, to slip out the door without anyone noticing, but her wheelchair made disappearing impossible. The laughter rolled through the diner again, sharper this time, like the crack of dry wood snapping in the heat. She felt the weight of every stare, some curious, some pitying, some laced with the same quiet judgment she'd felt since the moment she'd come in. No one stood up, no one told them to stop. Somewhere in her chest, a familiar thought coiled tight: it's always easier for people to look away. And in that moment, she knew she was once again entirely on her own. The door to Sunny Diner swung open with a slow creak, letting in a wave of warm air from the street, and the sound of boots striking the tile floor. Heavy, deliberate steps carried a tall man into the room, a man whose presence seemed to draw the air tighter around him. He wore a black leather Hell's Angels jacket, the patches on the back catching the light from the front window, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. His beard was thick and streaked with gray, his jaw set in a way that made it clear he was not the kind of man you ignored. The rhythm of his boots striking the floor echoed briefly, then faded into the sudden lull in conversation. Aisha looked up from her sketchbook just long enough to see him pause inside the entrance, scanning the diner with pale, assessing eyes. His gaze moved easily over the counter, the booths, the faces that were now half turned toward him out of curiosity, and then it stopped on her. She felt her pulse jump. There was something in the way he looked at her, direct, unflinching, but not invasive. He didn't glance at the wheelchair the way most people did. He looked at her, straight and level, and she felt for the first time that morning that someone had actually seen her, not just the chair she sat in. But his attention shifted almost immediately, sliding toward the back booth where the three young men sat. The smirks on their faces told him enough. He saw the way one of them leaned back with his arms stretched along the top of the booth, his chin lifted in the lazy arrogance of someone who had never been challenged. He saw the way another drummed his fingers on the table in rhythm to his own laughter. And he saw the one closest to the aisle still half turned toward Aisha, his mouth curling with the satisfaction of a joke well delivered. The man didn't hesitate. He walked with slow, heavy steps past the counter, past the booths, his eyes locked briefly on Aisha again before he came to a stop beside her table. He set one gloved hand on the back of the chair opposite her, pulled it out, and lowered himself into it. The chair groaned slightly under his weight, and for a long moment, he simply sat there, studying her face as if he were reading something in her expression. "Little sister," he said quietly, his voice low and gravelly but without sharpness, "are they bothering you?" Aisha hesitated. Her instinct was to shake her head, to say she was fine, to avoid dragging anyone else into the moment. But he didn't look away, he didn't press her, either. Instead he leaned in slightly and added, "I know that look, I've worn it myself. They're not looking at you because they know you. They're looking at you because they've already decided you're less than them. I get it, they do it to me too. Not because I ride, but because they decided I'm an outsider before I even opened my mouth." Something in his tone, matter of fact without pity, made her throat tighten. She wanted to say thank you, to tell him he didn't have to get involved, but before she could find the words, he pushed back his chair and stood. The boots struck the floor again, steady and sure, as he turned to face the booth of young men. "All right, boys," he said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the diner. "I'm only going to say this once. In here we respect people. All people. You forget that somewhere along the way." The smirks froze for half a second before reforming into something meaner. The one leaning back laughed first, a sharp mocking sound. "What's this? The big bad biker's gonna teach us manners." His friend across the table grinned and added, "Looks like you're a little lost, man. This isn't your clubhouse." The third, the one who had been dragging his leg earlier in mockery, muttered just loud enough for the others to hear, "Trash like that rolls right in with the rest of the garbage." The tall man's face didn't change, though a flicker passed through his eyes, something colder, heavier. The rest of the diner had gone utterly still. Conversations had died mid-sentence. Even the waitress behind the counter had stopped wiping down the same mug for the third time. People were watching now, but most were doing it from the corners of their eyes, as if afraid to be caught staring. "Careful," the man said evenly, "because the words you throw around tell me more about you than you want me to know." The leader of the trio leaned forward, his elbows on the table, pretending to look amused. "You threatening me, old man?" The man didn't flinch. "Not yet," he said. "But I'm telling you to stop, right now." A shadow of uncertainty crossed the young man's face, but pride pushed it away quickly. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a phone, and started tapping at the screen. "You know what, let's get someone down here who can deal with this. I'm calling the cops, let's see how tough you are when they show up." His friends chuckled in low, mean tones, emboldened by the act. Aisha sat frozen, her fingers gripping the edge of her sketchbook so tightly she worried the cover might tear. She could feel the pulse in her neck, the air in the diner thick with an electricity that prickled at her skin. She had seen men like the ones in the booth before, men who believed the world would always bend in their favor. But she had never seen anyone stand so squarely between that kind of cruelty and its target without a hint of fear. The tall man didn't even glance at the phone. He just stood there, shoulders relaxed but solid, his eyes moving slowly from one young man to the next, as though weighing each of them in turn. There was no shouting, no swearing, no theatrics, just a stillness that made the space around him feel smaller, more contained. It was the stillness of someone who had stood in worse places than this, and walked away on his own terms. At the counter, a man in a ball cap shifted uncomfortably on his stool, glancing between the booth and the stranger in leather. Two women in the corner booth stopped talking altogether, their coffee cooling in front of them. Even the cook had leaned forward in the pass window, his spatula frozen in midair. The man in leather finally took a single step back, not in retreat, but in a way that seemed to give the young men room to make a choice. "This is your chance to fix it," he said plainly. "Take it." The leader smirked again, more for show than anything else, and lifted the phone to his ear. "Yeah," he said into it, "we've got some Hell's Angels guy in here threatening people. You better get someone down here before he hurts somebody." Aisha's stomach knotted. She could feel the eyes of the diner bouncing between the man in leather and the phone in the young man's hand. The stranger didn't move, didn't try to stop him. He just stood there, one hand resting lightly on the back of Aisha's chair, the weight of his presence enough to hold the moment in place. The call ended, the young man leaned back, satisfied, his friends whispering to each other with tight little grins. The sound of boots on tile shifted as the stranger returned to his seat across from Aisha, his expression unchanged. "They called the law," he said simply, as if noting the weather, then he met her gaze, his voice lowering again. "Don't worry, little sister, I've been through worse." The seconds stretched into minutes. Outside, the faint wail of a siren began to build in the distance. Inside, no one spoke above a murmur. The tension had a weight to it now, settling over the room like heavy cloth. Every person in the diner was aware of the same thing, that the moment was not over, that whatever came next would decide more than just who finished their breakfast in peace. And so they waited, eyes drifting toward the front door, listening to the growing sound of the siren and the faint crunch of tires on gravel as a patrol car approached. The wail of the siren grew louder until it seemed to press against the glass windows of the sunny diner. Outside, the pulsing blue and red lights bounced across the chrome of parked cars and the wide plate glass front. Two black and white patrol cars rolled up to the curb, tires crunching over the grit of the street. The sirens cut off in unison, replaced by the thrum of idling engines. Aisha felt her stomach knot tighter, her fingers curling against the edge of her sketchbook. Across from her, Malcolm Hayes sat with his hands resting on the table, calm and unmoving, his eyes fixed on the door, like a man watching the next card in a game he already knew how to play. The door opened, letting in a slice of hot morning air and the sound of boots hitting the diner's worn linoleum. Two uniformed officers stepped inside first, scanning the room with that quick practiced sweep that always made people straighten in their seats. Right behind them came another pair. The leader of the trio in the back booth straightened up with a grin that spread slowly across his face, his voice dripping satisfaction as he pointed toward Malcolm. "That's him," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "He's been threatening us, making a scene. I want him arrested." His friends nodded, wearing the same smug look of boys who had grown up knowing trouble never stuck to them. The nearest officer began moving toward Malcolm, but before he'd taken more than 2 steps, a voice from the back called out in surprise, "Dr. Hayes." The room seemed to shift on its axis at those 2 words. Aisha turned her head to see the source, a tall, broad-shouldered sergeant stepping in from the doorway, his sunglasses sliding down the bridge of his nose as he looked at Malcolm like he'd just seen a ghost. Malcolm's mouth curved into a faint smile, not of amusement but recognition. "Morning, Dan," he said evenly. For a beat nothing else happened. The younger officers glanced at one another, confusion written plainly across their faces. The sergeant removed his sunglasses completely now, still studying Malcolm as if to be sure. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his tone shifting from surprise to something warmer. "Didn't expect to see you back in town, Doc." The younger officer who'd been heading toward Malcolm slowed to a stop, glancing back toward his superior for direction. The leader of the 3 young men blinked, his smirk faltering just slightly. "Doc?" he echoed, the word landing awkwardly on his tongue. The sergeant glanced toward him briefly, then back to Malcolm. "This man," he said to the room at large, "is Dr. Malcolm Hayes, one of the best cardiothoracic surgeons in the state. Saved my cousin's life 2 years ago. And if any of you have been with the department long enough to get your annual physical, you've probably had him checking your heart." A ripple moved through the diner, quiet exclamations murmured recognition. Aisha saw the couple by the window exchange a wide-eyed look, the man whispering something to his wife. Even the cook leaned further out of the pass window, clearly piecing together what he was hearing. The sergeant wasn't done. "He also happens to be the older brother of our police chief," he added, "and the son of Richard and Eleanor Hayes, you know, the folks who've been funding the new library, the kids' sports complex, and about half the scholarships at the high school." He let the weight of that sink in. The chatter in the diner swelled just enough to become a hum of disbelief. The young men in the back booth no longer looked smug. The leader's mouth tightened, his eyes darting toward the officers as if trying to gauge whether his earlier story could still hold. His friends stared at the table, their postures shrinking in on themselves. The sergeant stepped fully into the center of the room now, his gaze moving between the 2 sides. "Why don't we all take a breath?" he said, his voice even but carrying the kind of authority that settled over a place like a heavy blanket. He turned to the younger officer nearest him. "Let's separate them, get statements, and check the security footage before we start deciding who's in the wrong here." One of the officers nodded and moved toward the counter where the manager had been standing half hidden in the back. The man looked nervous, but the moment the words security footage were mentioned, he scurried toward the office door without protest. Malcolm leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands loosely in front of him. His eyes found Aisha's for a moment, and though he didn't smile, there was something in his look that told her he had expected this turn all along. She felt a strange mixture of relief and awe, realizing that his calm wasn't bravado, it was the steadiness of a man who had weathered worse storms. Around the room, customers were no longer pretending not to watch. Conversations buzzed in low tones, some tinged with curiosity, others with a sort of embarrassed recognition that they had been quick to assume the worst about the man in leather. A woman in a blue dress whispered to her companion, "That's the Hayes family doctor. I thought he was just some biker passing through." Her companion shook his head slowly, as if reconsidering more than just Malcolm's appearance. The officers moved the 3 young men to stand by the far wall near the front window. They no longer looked like they owned the place. The leader kept glancing toward the door as though hoping for an escape, but the patrol cars outside made it clear there was none. The sergeant spoke briefly with Malcolm, his tone respectful, before turning back to oversee the retrieval of the video. Aisha sat quietly, the thrum of adrenaline still moving through her, but now it mingled with a cautious hope. The tide in the room had shifted, and she could feel it in the way people's eyes moved, not with the same quiet judgment as before, but with something closer to shame or self-reflection. She wondered if any of them would remember that it had taken the mention of a title, a family name, and a list of donations to see Malcolm differently. The hum of conversation broke again when the manager returned from the office with a small flash drive clutched in his hand. One of the officers took it and stepped outside to load it into the laptop in the patrol car. The rest of the room waited, suspended in that peculiar silence that comes when everyone knows a truth is about to be laid bare. Malcolm didn't move, didn't try to explain himself further. He simply rested his forearms on the table, his eyes steady on the door. Across the diner, the young men shifted their weight from foot to foot, their earlier confidence evaporating under the collective gaze of the room. When the officer returned and handed the flash drive to the sergeant, the big man nodded once and turned toward the counter where the small wall-mounted television usually played the morning news. The manager switched inputs, and the black screen flickered to life. The grainy security footage appeared, the camera angle catching the entire row of booths, Aisha's table, and the path leading to the counter. And in that frozen moment before the video began to play, the air in Sunny Diner seemed to grow even heavier, every eye fixed on the screen, waiting for the proof of what had really happened. The grainy footage began to roll on the small wall-mounted television, the timestamp in the corner showing just minutes earlier. The camera's wide angle caught the row of booths along the wall, Aisha's table by the window, and the narrow aisle between. At first the low hiss of the playback was almost drowned out by the sound of the diner itself, shifting chairs, coffee being poured, but within seconds, the room fell into the kind of silence that swallows every small noise. All eyes were on the screen. There it was, clearer than any testimony, the three young men leaning toward each other in the back booth, grinning with their heads tilted toward Aisha. One raised his arms and mimed turning invisible wheels, lips shaping words the room didn't need to hear to understand. Another dragged his leg theatrically along the aisle, face twisted into a cruel parody of sympathy. The third tapped his fingers on the table in rhythm to their laughter, his gaze locked on Aisha like she was nothing more than a prop in their little performance. Aisha watched herself on that screen, her shoulders drawn inward, eyes pinned to the menu, hands gripping its edges like it was the only solid thing left in the room. Seeing it from the outside made her chest tighten. There was no mistaking the humiliation in her posture, the way she seemed to shrink into herself. She bit the inside of her cheek, glancing sideways at Malcolm, who sat across from her now in real life just as he had in the video. He didn't look at the screen, he looked at her, his eyes steady, as if reminding her she wasn't back in that moment alone. Then came the part where he appeared in the footage, stepping into frame, boots striking the floor with slow certainty. He stopped at her table, sat down, spoke to her briefly. On the silent footage, she could see her own hesitant nod, the way her eyes had flicked up to meet his for the first time. In the real diner now, she remembered that moment vividly, how his voice had carried no pity, only a calm recognition, and how for a split second she'd felt the ground beneath her steady. The video showed him rising, turning toward the booth, his posture firm and gestures measured. No threat, no looming over their table, no raised fist, just words, just presence. The playback caught the smug tilt of the young men's chins, the mock outrage when one of them pulled out his phone to call the police. It caught the way Malcolm stayed still, a hand resting on the back of her chair, not holding her in place, but there, like an anchor in the storm. When the footage ended, the screen went black. The room stayed silent for a long breath before the sergeant spoke. "That's all I need to see." His voice had the finality of a gavel. He turned to his officers, "Write them up for public harassment with racial motivation, 6-month ban from this establishment, 50 hours of community service each." His gaze landed on the ringleader. "And I suggest you think long and hard about how that looked on screen, because that's who you are when you think no one's watching." The three young men were ushered toward the door, their earlier swagger gone, replaced by tight shoulders and downcast eyes. The door closed behind them with a sharp thud. The manager stepped out from behind the counter, twisting a rag in his hands. "Miss Robinson," he began, his voice low, I owe you an apology, I should have stepped in before it got that far. I'm sorry. He hesitated, then added, breakfast is on the house, any time you come in here. Aisha opened her mouth, then closed it, glancing again at Malcolm before answering. Thank you, she said softly, and for the first time that morning, her voice didn't shake. She turned fully toward him now. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly, but you did. Why? Malcolm leaned back slightly, one arm draped over the back of his chair, eyes never leaving hers. Because I've been where you are, he replied, his tone even. Different reasons, same look in people's eyes, and I know what it means to have someone step up when the room stays silent. She let that settle in, feeling the weight and truth in his words. Most people don't, she said finally. Most people wait for someone else to do it, he said. But if you're there, and you know it's wrong, you are that someone else. Somewhere near the counter, a man in a plaid shirt pulled out his phone and began recording the television replay from earlier. By the time the patrol cars pulled away, the clip was already being passed around online. Comments began appearing before Aisha even left her seat. Out in the wider world, people would see a leather-clad biker standing in quiet defiance between a young woman in a wheelchair and 3 smirking bullies. Malcolm glanced toward the window where the police cars had been, then back to her. Don't let today make you smaller, he said. Make it make you bigger. Aisha gave a short nod, a faint smile touching her lips. For the first time that morning, she felt like she could breathe without bracing herself. As the low murmur of resumed conversation filled the diner, she realized the story that had started with her humiliation was ending with her being seen, truly seen, and with someone beside her who understood exactly why that mattered. 2 days later, the air in the town's community center buzzed with the low murmur of folding chairs scraping against the floor, people shifting in their seats, and the faint hum of the old ceiling fans. Aisha sat in the second row, her hands resting loosely on her lap, her sketchbook closed beside her. Since the incident at Sunny Diner, she had heard the words "I'm sorry" more times than she could count, from strangers on the street, from people who had been there that day but had stayed quiet, from the manager who now seemed to trip over himself to greet her. But hearing it was different from feeling it, and now for the first time in a long while, she could feel it. The eyes that met hers in the days since were no longer filled with pity or dismissal, they held respect, and in some cases an awkward kind of admiration. Malcolm Hayes stood off to the side of the small stage, dressed not in his Hell's Angels jacket, but in a pressed shirt and blazer, his boots still polished and his beard just as it had been. When he caught Aisha's eye, he made his way over, moving with the same steady confidence she remembered from the diner. Leaning down slightly so only she could hear, his voice was low but clear. You've always had value, he said. You didn't need me to give it to you. The only difference now is that more people have finally found the courage to see it. Aisha felt the words land deep inside her, somewhere beneath the place where her pride lived, and she nodded without speaking. When the mayor introduced him, Malcolm stepped to the podium, the old microphone squealing softly before settling into a clear hum. He rested both hands on the wood, scanning the rows of familiar faces, shop owners, teachers, officers, families who had lived here for generations. His voice carried easily through the room, steady and unhurried. A few days ago, he began, I stood in a diner between a young woman and 3 men who thought it was their right to humiliate her. What you saw afterward on that security footage was the truth. What many of you didn't see is what could have happened if the situation had been different. He paused, letting the quiet settle over the room. That day I was protected not just by the law, but by my name, my profession, and my family's standing in this community. People know me here, they know what I do, who my parents are, what my family has given to this town. But I have to ask, if I had been just another biker passing through, if Aisha had been someone you didn't recognize, would we have walked out of that diner with the truth on our side? Or would the story have been written differently before we even had a chance to speak? A faint rustle moved through the crowd, shifts in posture, a throat cleared somewhere in the back, the sound of people feeling the weight of the question before they could form an answer. Malcolm's gaze swept the room, landing on different faces, never lingering too long but never avoiding anyone. This question, he continued, is not mine alone to answer, it belongs to every single one of you. The way you answer it, not just here in this hall, but in your own hearts, will shape the face of this town long after we're gone." He let the silence hang, not as an absence, but as a space for the truth to move into. Then he stepped back from the podium, his expression calm but unyielding. The applause started slowly, from somewhere in the middle of the room, then grew into a steady swell, though it carried the sound of thoughtfulness more than celebration. The following day, clips of his speech began circulating online. The same video that had first shown the incident at the diner was now joined by footage of Malcolm's words, filmed on phones from different angles, shared with captions that varied from praise to challenge. In living rooms, coffee shops, and break rooms, people replayed the moment he asked that question. On local talk shows, callers debated whether the town had been given a mirror, and if they were brave enough to look into it. Hashtags appeared, comments multiplied, and the conversation spread beyond the county line. When the evening sun began to dip low, painting the community center windows in shades of gold, the event was over. Aisha wheeled herself toward the double doors, her sketchbook balanced on her lap. As she passed Malcolm, he gave her a small nod, one that spoke of shared understanding rather than farewell. Outside, the air was warm and open. She rolled forward into it, lifting her chin, the hum of conversation from inside fading behind her. The people who passed on the sidewalk made way for her without hesitation, some smiling, some simply meeting her eyes without looking away. For the first time in a long while, she felt no need to disappear into the background. The sun caught in her hair as she moved down the street, her posture tall even in the chair, and if the town still had work to do, and she knew it did, at least now the question had been asked aloud for everyone to hear. The screen fades to black, and across it appears the words, "True justice should never depend on status or wealth."
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.